The suit was 2 sizes too big, and the left cuff kept sliding over my hand every time I moved my arm. I kept pushing it back. It kept sliding down. The airlock hissed, the docking clamp groaned like old bones, and I stepped onto the Velori diplomatic station wearing a borrowed suit that smelled like someone else's cologne, and carrying a briefcase that belonged to a man currently horizontal in a medical bay back on the transit hub, defeated by potato salad. His name was Colin Marsh, Senior Diplomatic Liaison, 12 years of interspecies negotiation experience, 3 commendations from the Galactic Contact Bureau, and 1 very bad decision at the farewell catered lunch. He had looked up at me from the medical cot with the eyes of a man watching his career flash before him and said, "Webb, you have to go in my place." I had said, "I'm the aide, Colin." He had said, "You're the only one cleared for the station." I had said, "I carry the briefcase. I take notes. That is the entire scope of my function." He had said nothing, because at that point he was busy being sick again. So there I was. The corridor inside the station was long and white and completely, aggressively silent. Not quiet, silent. The difference matters. Quiet is just the absence of noise. Silent is when a space has been engineered to eat sound, when the walls are doing something deliberate with your footsteps and your breathing, and the small nervous sounds a human body makes without permission. My footsteps made no echo. That bothered me more than anything else so far. I had been briefed. Of course I had been briefed. The Velori were an advanced species, 700 years ahead of humanity in space travel, with a diplomatic tradition older than most Earth civilizations. They communicated in layered tonal patterns, experienced color in spectrums humans could not perceive, and organized their society around a concept that translated loosely as assessed harmony. They were not hostile. They were not warm. They were intensely, deliberately neutral until they had decided what you were worth. The briefing had not mentioned the lights. The lights hummed. Not audibly, not in any frequency I could consciously hear, but my back teeth knew about it. My back teeth were filing a formal complaint. The entire electromagnetic situation in this corridor was doing something to the inside of my jaw that I did not appreciate and had no diplomatic language to address. I kept walking. The delegation waiting room, if you could call it that, was a large circular space with a ceiling that opened into a dark overhead panel embedded with what looked like captured points of light. Stars, maybe, or a very expensive ceiling feature. The floor was a pale material that absorbed footsteps the same way the corridor had. Everything in this station was designed to receive without giving back. I set the briefcase down, pushed the cuff back up, looked around. There were 6 Velori in the room. The briefing had prepared me for their appearance in the way that a photograph prepares you for a thunderstorm. Technically accurate, emotionally useless. They were tall, each of them, with a build that suggested something between angular and deliberately composed, as though their bodies had decided on a final answer and committed to it. Their skin carried an undertone that shifted in the light, not dramatically, not like a color change, more like the way water looks different depending on what is beneath it. Their eyes were wide-set and dark, and they had 2 slender antennae that rose from just above their temples, moving with a slow, constant, independent awareness that their faces did not always match. The antennae were the honest part, I would later understand. The faces were the professional part. All 6 of them looked at me. Not glanced. Looked. The full, assessing, unblinking kind of look that most species only deploy during a confrontation or an examination. I had read about Velori threat assessment. I knew, intellectually, that this was a standard intake scan, that they were reading my biometric patterns, my stress markers, my posture and micro-expression, and probably 6 things about my cardiovascular system I did not know myself. I smiled anyway. Not a big smile, a Baltimore smile, the kind that says I see what you are doing and I am not offended and I am also not going anywhere. One of the 6 shifted almost imperceptibly. I noticed. I was not supposed to notice, or maybe no one had before, hard to say. The one who shifted was standing slightly apart from the others. Not behind them, not in front, but offset in a way that initially read as background and then, the longer I looked, resolved into something different. Positioned to see the entire room, every angle covered, every entrance and exit in her sightline simultaneously. She was not decoration, she was infrastructure. Her antennae were moving in a different pattern from the others, slower, more deliberate, like they were taking notes. Before I could think about that further, the lead diplomat stepped forward. His name, the briefing card said, was First Voice Arundel. He was tall even by Valori standards, with the kind of formal bearing that comes from decades of being the most important person in any given room. He looked at me, then at the empty space beside me, where Colin Marsh should have been. Then back at me. "You are not the primary diplomat," he said. His English was perfect, structured, precise, each word placed with the care of someone who had learned the language from documents rather than from people. "No, sir," I said. "The primary diplomat is assigned to this negotiation." He's indisposed." A pause, the Valori equivalent of a raised eyebrow, which involved no eyebrow movement whatsoever and communicated entirely through a 1-second delay in response. "Indisposed." "Potato salad," I said. The silence in the room acquired texture. Arundel processed this. I could not tell if he understood what potato salad was, if he was consulting some internal database on human food pathogens, or if he was simply recalibrating his expectations for the next 3 days of negotiation, based on the information that humanity had sent a man in an oversized borrowed suit, whose only explanation was a specific side dish. "You are his aide," Arundel said. "Marcus Webb, yes, sir." "Your clearance is confirmed. Your rank is not primary." "Correct." "You will observe. You will take record. You will not speak during formal session without invitation." "Understood." He studied me for another moment with the particular attention of someone deciding how much of a problem I was going to be. Then he turned, and the delegation moved toward the chamber entrance with the synchronized ease of people who had done this many times before. I picked up the briefcase, pushed the cuff back up. I looked at the one who had been standing offset from the others, the one with the different antenna pattern, the one who had already mapped every corner of this room before I arrived. She was looking at me, not with the formal assessment of the others, with something I could not name yet. I gave her the same Baltimore smile I had given the room. Her left antenna tilted, just slightly, just once. Then she turned and followed the delegation, and I followed her, and the silent corridor swallowed all of us without a sound. I pushed the cuff up one more time. Lord have mercy. This was going to be a week. The negotiation table was a long oval of pale material that I could not identify and was slightly warm to the touch, which I discovered by accident when I set the briefcase down on the edge. I pulled my hand back, made a note, added it to the growing internal document I was building titled Things Nobody Mentioned in the Briefing. Items so far included the sound-eating walls, the jaw-frequency lights, the warm table, and the fact that the chairs on the human side were clearly designed for Valori proportions, which meant my feet did not quite reach the floor, and I had the posture of a man who had been placed there by someone slightly larger. I sat straight anyway, crossed my ankles, adjusted the cuff. Across the table, the Valori delegation arranged themselves with a precision that looked natural but absolutely was not. Every position was deliberate. Every sightline had been considered. Arundel sat at the center, flanked by 2 advisors whose names the briefing card gave me as second voice Lethorin and third voice Kervmal. Behind them, slightly to the left, stood the one from the reception room. The briefing card listed her designation at the bottom, below the primary delegation, in a font 2 sizes smaller than everyone else. First Assessor Vale Sirth. No title elaboration, no diplomatic rank listed, just the function and the name. Squeezed into the footnotes of a document that spent 3 paragraphs on Arundel's preferred forms of address. I looked at her. She was already looking at Arundel, but her antennae were oriented toward the human delegation with a focus that had nothing to do with the direction of her eyes. The antennae were listening to one room while her face presented attention to another. The negotiations began. I will not pretend the first hour was gripping. Trade route negotiations between species are, at their core, an argument about math dressed up in ceremonial language. Our lead diplomat, Deputy Liaison Owen Park, was a capable and careful man who had prepared extensively, spoke in measured tones, and had the particular diplomatic skill of making every sentence sound like a reasonable compromise even when it was not. He presented the Bureau's proposed terms. Arundel received them. Second voice Lethorin raised 3 objections that third voice Kervmal then elaborated on while Owen wrote careful notes and our trade analyst. A focused woman named Claire Dunn cross-referenced figures on a tablet with the concentration of someone diffusing something. I took my own notes, that was my job. But I kept watching Vale Sirth. Not because I had decided to. More because once I started noticing the pattern, I could not stop seeing it. Every time a member of either delegation spoke, her antennae moved first. Before her eyes shifted, before any visible reaction crossed her face, the antennae had already processed the input and filed a verdict. Left one for tone, right one for content maybe. I was guessing, but I was not wrong, I was fairly sure. And when Lethorin raised the second objection, the one about the boundary coordinates in the Sirth cluster, Vale Sirth's left antenna tilted about 4 degrees to the right and held there for exactly as long as Lethorin was speaking, and returned to neutral the moment he finished. I wrote in my notepad, not on the official tablet, left antenna tilts when they are shaping a statement. I looked at it. I tore off the corner of the page and slid it across the table during the brief pause while Owen was consulting with Claire. Not to Arundel, not to the advisors. To Vale Sirth. The note said, "How do you know when they are lying?" She read it. I know she read it because her eyes moved over it in the specific pattern of reading rather than scanning. She held it for 2 seconds. Then she set it down on the table and returned her attention to the room. She did not respond. Obviously, she was a first assessor, not a pen pal. I was a diplomatic aide who had just passed a handwritten note to an alien official during a formal interspecies negotiation, because I had the professional restraint of a 12-year-old. Owen glanced at me. I pointed at the briefcase with an expression that said, "Logistics, don't worry about it." He returned to the negotiation. Lethorin began speaking again. His third objection, this one about scheduling the transit window assessment. His tone was agreeable. His posture was agreeable. His hands, which the briefing had noted were expressive in Valori communication, were arranged in the neutral configuration that the cultural guide described as open cooperation. Vale Sirth's left antenna tilted 4 degrees to the right. I tore off another corner of the page. "You just did it again. The left antenna thing, that was a lie, was it not?" I slid it across. This time she read it faster. The antenna on the right side, the one that had been still, moved, just once. A small adjustment like a gear catching. She picked up the first note. She placed it on top of the second note. She turned them over and wrote on the back of the bottom one with a precise, narrow instrument she produced from somewhere in her formal vestment. She slid them back. "One word." "Yes." I looked at it for a moment. I looked at her. She was already looking at Arundel, her antennae in their patient, constant, independent motion, reading the room the way the room did not know it was being read. I folded the 2 notes and put them in my jacket pocket. The negotiation continued. Owen made 3 strong points. Arundel received 2 of them and redirected the third with a grace that I had to admit was impressive. Claire caught a discrepancy in the resource allocation figures that bought the Bureau's position an additional 8% margin, and Owen presented it without a flicker of surprise, as though it had always been part of the plan, as though Claire had not just scribbled him a frantic note 30 seconds earlier. Somewhere in the second hour, Vale Sirth slid a note to me. I had not asked for one. It said, "Third voice Kervmal has repeated the word for boundary 7 times. Humans do not track word frequency in spoken negotiation. I have noted this in my assessment." I stared at it. Then I wrote back, "What does repeating the boundary word mean?" She wrote back almost immediately in the same narrow, precise hand, that it is the word he was instructed to repeat. It is not his concern. It is Arendel's. I sat with that for a moment. Then I wrote, "So the objections about scheduling are not about scheduling." She wrote, "They never are." I looked up at the room. Owen was presenting figures. Arundel was receiving them with perfect diplomatic stillness. Lethorin was nodding. Kervmal was quiet, hands in neutral configuration, and had not said the word for boundary in 11 minutes. Vale Sirth's right antenna tracked left, then returned. I wrote, "Do you always know this much and stay quiet about it?" A longer pause this time. "Then that is the function." I looked at the word function. I read it the way she had written it, clean, definitive, no complaint in it, no bitterness, no signal that it was anything other than a simple statement of fact. The handwriting of someone who had made peace with a room that used them like furniture and called it a posting. I did not write back immediately. I sat with it, the way you sit with something that lands heavier than expected. Outside the oval table, the negotiation measured its progress in careful increments. Inside my jacket pocket, 2 small torn pieces of paper had more information on them than half the briefing documents I had read on the transit over. When the session broke for the midday interval, the delegations filed out through separate corridors. Vale Sirth moved with the Valori group, precisely where she always was, offset from the primary formation, positioned to see everything, visible to no one who was not looking for her specifically. At the door she paused. She did not turn around, but her left antenna tilted back, just once, toward the room she was leaving, toward where I was still sitting. I pushed the cuff up. Owen appeared at my shoulder. "Good first session. You were quiet, I appreciate that." "I try," I said. "What were you writing so much?" "Notes," I said. "Logistics." He nodded and walked ahead. I looked at the door where Vale Sirth had been standing. Not for nothing, but the most useful person in that room had just spent 6 hours in the footnotes. That seemed like information worth having. Sleep was not happening. It was not a stress thing. It was not an anxiety thing. It was the lights. Even with the room set to its lowest output, the Valori station lighting maintained that subsonic hum that my back teeth had developed a strong opinion about. I had tried lying flat. I had tried the desk chair. I had tried the narrow bench near the observation port, which at least had the virtue of giving me something to look at. The stars out here were wrong, not wrong in a threatening way, wrong the way a word looks strange when you stare at it too long. The constellations I had memorized as a kid, lying on a flat roof in Baltimore on summer nights, were not here. There were new arrangements, unfamiliar geometry, the sky doing its own thing without consulting me. I had been awake for about 2 hours when I gave up and went walking. The corridors at this hour were empty. The same silence as before, but less loaded without delegations and protocol filling it. My footsteps disappeared into the floor. The lights had dimmed to a cooler register, blue adjacent, the way the station apparently simulated the Valori equivalent of night. I found the observation bay by accident. It was a wide room off a secondary corridor, one I had not been shown during the orientation tour. The ceiling was fully transparent, or the material that served as ceiling had gone clear, and the star field from outside pressed down through it in a way that felt both enormous and oddly quiet. No furniture, just the wide floor and the light from a galaxy that had not asked my opinion about any of this. Vale Scythe was there. She was sitting on the floor, near the far edge of the transparent ceiling. Not in any formal posture, not in any posture I had seen from her during the sessions. She was seated with her knees drawn loosely in front of her, her antennae at a resting angle I had not observed before. Slower, softer. The professional stillness she wore in the negotiation chamber had been set aside somewhere, and what remained was something that looked, in the blue-washed station light, like a person who had come to a quiet room to stop performing for a while. She heard me, obviously. A species that could track vocal frequency in a negotiation chamber was not going to miss footsteps. Her antennae acknowledged my presence without alarm, a small adjustment in their orientation. You are here, noted, no threat. I considered leaving. I had wandered into something that was not meant for me. She had found this room for a reason. I also considered that she had not left. I walked in slowly and sat down on the floor a good distance from her, close enough to be in the same room in a companionable sense, far enough that the space between us was its own statement. I looked up at the ceiling. The stars outside were still doing their own geometry. Neither of us said anything for a while. I have a tendency under silence to fill it. It is a Baltimore thing, or maybe just a Webb thing, the reflexive belief that quiet is a problem to be solved. But something about the room and the hour and the particular quality of her stillness told me the silence was not a problem. It was the point. So I sat in it. She spoke first. "You are not sleeping." "No," I said. "Your species requires more rest than ours." "I know, I'm working on it." "The lighting frequency disturbs you." I turned to look at her. She was still watching the stars, but her right antenna had oriented slightly toward me, listening. "Yeah," I said. "My back teeth have filed a formal complaint." A pause. "Back teeth," she said. "Not a question exactly. More the way you repeat a phrase that arrived in an unexpected shape. It hums at a frequency I can feel but not hear, somewhere in the jaw." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I will note it to the station's facilities coordinator. The resonance is calibrated for Valori biology. It was not considered." "You don't have to do that. It is a practical correction." "Still." Another pause. "Still," she repeated. I turned back to the ceiling. Outside, a small light moved across the star field, slow and purposeful. A ship, maybe, or a satellite, something with direction. "Where are you from?" she asked. The question was so straightforward that it caught me off guard. Not diplomatically phrased, not structured like a formal inquiry. Just a question, the way a person asks a question. "Baltimore," I said. "City on the east coast of North America, on Earth." "I know of Earth. I have studied its geography." "Then you know more about it than most of the people I've met up here." She considered this. "You have been to many stations." "4," I said. "This is my 4th posting. First one is primary, which is not exactly accurate because I'm not primary, I'm just the only one upright." "Colin Marsh," she said. "Potato salad," I said. The particular silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. It took me a moment to understand why. She was doing the Valori equivalent of trying not to react. "You find that funny," I said. "Humor is not a standard response in assessment context," she said. "We're not in assessment context right now." Her antennae shifted, a small movement but both of them together, a synchronized tilt that the sessions had not produced. "No," she said, "we are not." I leaned back slightly, hands on the floor behind me, and looked at the ceiling seriously for a moment. Baltimore in summer, flat roof. The harbor smell carried on warm air. My mother's voice from somewhere below telling me dinner was ready and I could look at the sky when it was not dinner time. Baltimore has crabs, I said. Crustaceans, she said. Yes, but specifically Baltimore crabs, which is different. You eat them with Old Bay seasoning, which is a spice blend, and you sit outside at a table covered in paper, and there is a wooden mallet involved, and it takes about 45 minutes to eat what would take 10 minutes to eat without the shell, and nobody minds because that is the whole point. She was quiet for a moment. Old Bay is a chemical compound. I laughed. It surprised me, the volume of it in the quiet room. A real laugh, not the polite diplomatic kind, the kind that comes out before you have decided to let it. Her antennae both stopped moving for 1 full second. Yeah, I said when I had settled. Yeah, I guess technically it is. Your laugh is loud, she said. I know, I'm a loud person generally. I've been very contained this week. I noticed, she said. The way she said it was not critical, not a complaint, more the way you note a thing that was effortful. Nobody laughs near you much, do they? I said. Not a question. It had landed as a fact before I finished saying it. She did not answer immediately. Her antennae returned to their slow resting motion. The stars outside continued their indifferent geometry. I am a threat assessor, she said finally. Laughter is not a common response. What is? Formal acknowledgement, procedural compliance, a pause, occasionally discomfort. Discomfort from who? She did not answer that one. I did not push it. We sat in the quiet and watched the stars for a while. I told her about the harbor, about the way it smells on an August morning, which is not a good smell by any scientific standard, but is the smell that means home in a way that overrides science completely. I told her about summer nights and the roof and learning the sky before I knew there were people out here in it. She listened. Her antennae listened harder. You mapped the sky from a domestic structure, she said. A roof, yeah. And then you left to come to the sky. Eventually. Why? I thought about it for longer than she probably expected, because it turned out the sky was bigger than I thought, and I had already lost some people, and staying in one place after that felt like something I had not earned. I had not planned to say that last part. She did not ask me to explain it. In 43 assessments, she said, and her voice was different, careful in a new way, no diplomat has learned my designation during the assignment period. A pause. You learned it in the first hour. The room held that. Vale Sirth, I said. Yeah. Why, she said. One word, clean and direct in the way that questions are when they matter. Because that is your name, hun, I said. The stars did their thing outside, indifferent and enormous and continuing without us. She did not respond. But her antennae, both of them, tilted forward by a fraction of a degree and held there. Like something that had been waiting for a very long time to be said had finally been said, and now did not quite know what to do with itself. I did not explain it. I did not walk it back. I let it sit exactly where it had landed, in the quiet blue light of a room neither of us was supposed to be in, under stars that had not asked permission from anyone. After a while she said, "The resonance calibration will be corrected before morning shift." You did not have to do that, I said. I know, she said. And somehow that was the most honest thing either of us had said. The third day started with a translation error. I want to be precise about this because the incident report that would later be filed described it as a communication interface discrepancy. And while that is technically accurate, it is also the kind of language designed to make something that nearly set two species on a collision course sound like a software glitch. A software glitch does not make 6 Valori officials go completely still in a way that is different from their usual stillness. Their usual stillness is professional. This one was the stillness of a species that has been insulted at a structural level and is deciding what to do about it. The session had started well. Owen was sharp. Claire had prepared an updated resource table overnight that answered 3 of the previous day's objections before they could be raised. Deputy Coordinator Paul Reeves, who handled the Bureau's transit infrastructure concerns, had a clear and well-ordered presentation that moved through its points efficiently. On the Velori side, Arundel had arrived with a posture that I had learned, over 2 days of watching, meant he had come prepared to close ground. His advisors were settled. Even Lethorin's agenda seemed to have compressed since the day before. For about 40 minutes, it looked like this was going to work. Then the translation interface processed the resource allocation clause. The Bureau's original text had used the phrase territorial consideration in the context of the transit window, meaning a consideration of geographic proximity in scheduling. It was a standard phrasing used in 12 previous Bureau agreements. The Velori translation matrix, however, had a different register for territorial depending on context, and the context flags in the interface had been set during the initial system configuration by someone who had not checked the Velori diplomatic lexicon past the first 3 entries. What Arundel's interface delivered was not scheduling consideration based on proximity. What Arundel's interface delivered was claim of domain rights over the Scythe cluster. The Scythe cluster, as it happened, was a region of significant historical and cultural weight to the Velori, the kind of place that does not appear in resource allocation spreadsheets without consequences. Arundel stopped mid-reception. Second voice, Lethorin turned to look at him. Third voice, Kervmal's hands moved to the closed formal configuration, which the cultural briefing described as signal of unresolved challenge. On our side, Owen had not yet seen what the interface had produced. He was still looking at his own materials. Claire had not looked up. Paul Reeves was finishing a sentence. Vale Scythe's antennae were moving in a pattern I had not seen before. Both of them were at full elevation, oriented directly at Arundel, and they were not still. They were processing rapidly. The way they moved when she was reading a room at speed and the room was giving her more information than usual. Her face was, as always, composed. Her antennae were not. She had already assessed the situation. She was watching to see what Arundel would do with it. He exhaled, a slow, controlled sound that traveled across the table like a change in pressure. "Your delegation," he said, with precision that was a different kind of precision from his earlier precision, has presented a territorial claim over a Velori heritage site. Owen's head came up. "I apologize," he said immediately, which was the right instinct even before he knew what had happened. "Could you indicate which passage prompted that reading?" Lethorin spoke before Arundel could redirect him, and when Lethorin spoke his voice had found a register it had not used in 2 days. Sharp, clipped, the Velori equivalent of someone who had been waiting for a reason. "It is in the allocation text, territorial consideration, Scythe cluster. The Bureau has placed a claim language on a region which is not and has never been under transit jurisdiction." "That was not the intent," Owen said. "Intent and language are not the same." "I understand that, and I want to." "The Scythe cluster was named in your document." Lethorin's hands had moved, not to the closed formal configuration, to something else, something the briefing had not covered, something that made Arundel glance at him sideways in a way that was not a look of agreement. The room had separated. That was the word for it. Not an explosion, not a walkout, but a room that had been a shared negotiating space 60 seconds ago and was now 2 distinct camps with a charged distance between them. Owen was good. He was doing what good diplomats do, which is speak clearly and stay calm and not let the pace of someone else's anger set the tempo of the conversation. But he was working from behind. The translation error was documented. The word was in the text. You cannot unring a bell by explaining what you meant when you rang it. Claire leaned toward Owen and said something quietly. He listened. His expression stayed level, but his shoulders shifted 2 degrees toward tight. Paul Reeves said, "If we could table the allocation clause temporarily and move to the transit framework." "Nothing will be tabled," Lethorin said. Arundel said, "Lethorin." A warning in 2 syllables, quiet, absolute. Lethorin went still. The room was in that particular suspended state where everyone is waiting for someone else to set the temperature. Our delegation needed space to correct the record. The Valori delegation was split between Arundel's disciplined processing and Lethorin's activated grievance. Both sides had people who wanted to fix it. Both sides also had pressure pulling in the other direction. I looked at Vale Sirth. She was reading the room with everything she had. Both antennae at elevation, her posture fractionally forward, her eyes moving in the pattern I recognized from the note-passing session, the one that tracked frequency and repetition, and everything people communicated without meaning to. She knew exactly what each person at this table needed to hear. She was in the footnotes. I stood up. Owen's head turned toward me immediately, and the expression on his face was a professional diplomat's version of absolute alarm. I had approximately 2 seconds of goodwill before he would gently and firmly redirect the room's attention away from the aide who was not supposed to be standing. I did not look at Owen. I looked at Vale Sirth. "You have been reading this room all week," I said, not loud, not a speech, just a sentence directed at a person. "What do you need from us right now to make this work?" The silence was so complete that I became briefly aware of my own heartbeat. Arundel turned to look at her. Not with the look of a superior addressing a subordinate, with the look of someone who had not thought to ask that question and was now watching what happened when someone did. Vale Sirth's antennae moved. Then they settled. When she spoke, her voice was the same voice she always used, measured, precise, every word chosen with the economy of someone who had learned that what she said needed to earn its place. She addressed Owen directly. "Your delegation should present a written acknowledgement of the translation error, entered into the formal record before any further discussion. This is not an apology. It is a correction of record. Arundel can accept a record correction without it requiring a position change on the underlying terms." Owen nodded once. She turned to Arundel. "The allocation clause can be suspended from active discussion and assigned to a joint review panel, which is standard procedure under the contact framework. This preserves the Valori position without requiring either delegation to withdraw from the table." She turned to Lethorin, and her voice did not change, but something in her posture made the address a direct one. Second voice, Lethorin's concern about the heritage designation is noted and valid. It should be placed in the formal record as a standing concern of the Valori delegation, separate from the translation issue, so that it is documented as an independent matter. 30 seconds. She had given everyone in the room exactly what they needed to take a step back without losing ground. Owen said, "That is acceptable from the Bureau's position." Arundel said, "It is acceptable." Lethorin was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a short, formal acknowledgement that the cultural briefing described as reluctant agreement. The pressure in the room dropped about 15 degrees. People began moving. Claire was already preparing the corrected record notation. Paul Reeves was pulling up the joint review panel framework. The Valori advisors shifted back into working posture. The temperature of the session had returned to something functional. I sat down. Owen glanced at me. The expression had changed. No longer alarm. Something more complicated, a recalibration he was doing in real time about who had just been standing at his left for 2 days without him fully registering what was there. I arranged my notepad. Pushed the cuff back up. Across the room, I saw Vale Scythe's superior, a broad, senior official whose name the briefing had listed as Protocol Director Serven, move close to her and speak in a low tone. I watched it because I was already watching her side of the room. I could not hear it. The sound-eating walls made sure of that. I did not need to. Her left antenna tilted 4 degrees to the right. Serven spoke for about 45 seconds. She stood straight throughout. Her antennae settled into neutral by the end of his words, which is not the same thing as agreeing with them. Her face maintained the composure she had worn every day of this week, as though it had been applied that morning along with everything else. When Serven finished and moved away, she turned her attention back to the table. Her right antenna moved once, a small, inward adjustment, the kind of motion I had only seen once before in the observation bay in the blue nightlight when she had processed something that landed heavier than expected. I looked down at my notepad. Lord have mercy. She had just saved the negotiation. Solved in 30 seconds what the room had been tearing itself apart over, and the man standing next to her had spent 45 seconds explaining why she had overstepped. I wrote nothing in my notepad. Some things do not belong in the official record. The departure protocol was scheduled for the morning of the 4th day. I had not slept again, but for different reasons. Not the lights this time. The lights had been corrected as promised, the correction made silently and without announcement, the hum gone when I woke the next morning and did not notice it was gone until I realized my jaw had unclenched. Some problems get fixed quietly. You only know they were real by the absence they leave. Owen had filed the session report the night before. I had helped him draft it, which was the most age-appropriate thing I had done all week. The report recorded the negotiation outcomes, the joint review panel assignment, the corrected allocation language, and the agreed transit framework. It was accurate. It was thorough. It mentioned in one clause in the summary section that an ad hoc communication intervention had helped redirect the session after the translation error. He had looked at me when he wrote that clause. I had said, "That is fair." He had said, "I owe you a conversation when we're back." I had said, "Potato salad, Owen. It all comes down to potato salad." He had laughed. It was tired laughter, the kind that comes out at the end of a hard week when the pressure finally lifts, but it was real. In the morning, the delegations assembled in the departure bay. It was a wide, formal space, higher ceiling than the negotiation chamber, with the same light-absorbing walls but a warmth to the air that the other rooms had not had. An architectural choice, maybe. A way of signaling that what happens in departure bays is different from what happens in working sessions. There were handshakes, formal acknowledgments. Arundel and Owen exchanged closing statements that had been prepared by both sides the night before and were delivered with the mutual relief of people who had arrived at the far end of something difficult and were glad to be standing on solid ground again. Lethorin gave the Bureau delegation a formal farewell gesture that was warmer than anything he had offered during the sessions. Kervmal did the same. Claire received a small Valori documentation token from the junior advisor she had spent 3 days trading spreadsheet corrections with across the table, and she held it the way you hold something unexpected that turns out to be the nicest part of the whole experience. Paul Reeves shook 7 hands and thanked everyone by name, and mispronounced 2 of the names and apologized and mispronounced them again in a different direction. And somehow this was received with the closest thing to warmth the Valori delegation had collectively expressed all week. Humans are a specific kind of strange. I was at the end of the line. This was intentional on my part. I had managed the lineup with the casual precision of someone who had arranged things this way and was not going to admit it. Owen at the front with the formal departure statement. Claire and Paul in the middle doing the genuine person-to-person part. Me at the end, at the tail of the human column, because the last person in a departure line is the last person processed, and the person who processes departures on the Valori side is the first assessor. I had known this since the briefing document. The human delegation moved through. I watched, I waited. When the last of them had passed through the formal acknowledgement and moved toward the docking corridor, Vale Sirth stepped forward. This was procedure. She had done it for every departure from this station, 43 times before this one. The final assessment, the formal clearance, the verification that no diplomatic incident had been created or ongoing concern registered. She stood in front of me. She was in full formal vestment, the kind the assessors wear for official proceedings rather than the lighter version she had worn during the sessions. It was composed and structured and deliberate in all the ways that her posture during working hours was composed and structured and deliberate. Her antennae were still. Both of them, not the resting motion from the observation bay, not the elevated processing pattern from the crisis session. Still, present, the way a person goes still when something matters. "Marcus Webb," she said. "Diplomatic Aid, Bureau of Interspecies Contact, Earth Designation." "That's me," I said. "Your clearance for departure from Valori Station 7 is confirmed." Her voice was formal, the protocol voice. "Then, because this was also procedure," she said, "do you carry any materials from the negotiation that require joint documentation?" "No," I said. "Do you have any unresolved concerns from the assessment period?" And here is where I should have said no. Protocol said no. The departure script said no. Every piece of diplomatic training I had received, second-hand and informal as it was, said you say no and you move down the corridor and you go home and you write the report and you file it, and that is where it ends. I looked at her. I looked at the 43 assessments behind her eyes. I looked at the precision of her that nobody had ever pointed at long enough to see it was a person. I looked at the morning in the observation bay and the note that said yes, and the blue-washed star light and the way she had said, "I know," when I told her she did not have to correct the lights. I looked at what had happened to her yesterday after she had saved the room, and Servan had stood beside her for 45 seconds explaining it back into a problem. I looked at her antennae, both still waiting. "No unresolved concerns," I said. She gave a formal nod of acknowledgement. Then I said it. Quiet, unhurried. Not a performance and not a line and not the kind of thing you say to fill a silence. "You are beautiful, Vale Sirth." She froze. Not the diplomatic stillness. Not the threat assessment neutrality. Not the composed professional composure she wore like formal vestment over everything else she was. She froze. Every antenna stopped. Both of them together, in a complete, total, absolute cessation of motion that I had not seen in 4 days of watching her. The antennae that tracked everything, that processed rooms and voices and frequencies and deception before the faces around them knew they were being read. The antennae that had been moving in some form of active processing every moment I had seen her, waking or formal or quiet in the night, went still. Her eyes held mine. In 19 years, she had filed 43 assessments. She had stood in 43 departure bays and processed 43 delegations through the final clearance and gone back to the station, and written the reports in the language of function and data and threat rating scores. No one had said her name unless they had to. No one had passed her notes. No one had sat with her at 3 in the morning under the wrong stars and asked why she knew what she knew, and then stayed quiet long enough for her to consider answering. No one had stood up in a room full of people with rank and said her name and asked her what she needed. No one had said this. Not her function, not her accuracy, not her 19 years of correct assessments and never-wrong antenna reads and the running record of a person whose gift had been so thoroughly absorbed into institutional usefulness that the institution had stopped noticing it came from somewhere. Sorry. The silence in the departure bay was a different kind of silence from the corridor silence. The corridor silence was engineered. This one was just what happened when time takes one breath and holds it. I picked up my briefcase. I pushed the cuff back up. I looked at her one last time. Her antennae were still. Then slowly, the right one moved. The smallest possible adjustment. A fraction of a degree, forward and down. The motion I had seen once before in the observation bay when she was processing something that arrived larger than expected and took a moment to settle into whatever space had been made for it. She inhaled. When she spoke, her voice was precise and clear as it always was, but the grammar was different. I had spent 4 days listening to Valori speech patterns, and this construction was not one I had heard from any of them. It was assembled from somewhere else, from one of the 214 dialects she had studied, chosen with care, used once. Safe travels, Marcus Webb. First name. His. Not the formal designation. Not diplomatic aid, Bureau of Interspecies Contact. His name, given back to him the way he had given hers. Because that is what names are for, and she had known that for a very long time, and had simply never had anyone to demonstrate it with. I smiled. The Baltimore kind. The one that says I see you and I am glad, and I have no agenda about any of this. Take care of yourself, hun, I said. I walked down the docking corridor. Behind me, the departure bay was silent. I did not turn around. I have been to 4 first contacts now. I have signed my name to 3 formal agreements that will be cited in diplomatic literature for the next 100 years. I have watched humanity surprise an alien species with our stubbornness, our noise, our irrational attachment to food-related traditions, and our specific talent for walking into rooms we were not entirely prepared for and coming out the other side anyway. The debrief forms always ask the same question: what was the turning point in the contact relationship? I always write the same answer. Human communication style proved unexpectedly effective in establishing trust across species behavioral norms. It is accurate, it passes review. Nobody asks follow-up questions. What I do not write is this. I do not write that the turning point was a torn corner of a notepad page. I do not write that I spent 4 days watching a person that a room full of diplomats and officials and trained specialists had spent 4 days not watching, and that the watching was the whole thing, that it was the only thing, that all of it followed from that. I do not write that she had studied 214 dialects and chosen Baltimore. I do not write that she corrected the lights. I do not write about the observation bay or the star field or the word, still, applied to antennae that had not been still in 19 years. I do not write that when I walked down that docking corridor, I was thinking about a roof in Baltimore in August, about the sky before I knew there were people out in it, about what it costs to be seen by no one for a very long time and what it does to a person, and what a single moment of being genuinely, straightforwardly, no footnotes seen can do in the other direction. I do not write any of that. I write, human communication style proved unexpectedly effective. Lord have mercy, the things I leave out of reports.